Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm your host, Rob Reed, and this is a very unusual episode because today, June 18th, is an unusual day, and that a talk I gave several weeks back at the annual TED conference was just posted to the front page of TED.com, and this episode is an expansion on and a companion to that talk. First, to orient those of you who are listening for the first time, this show is normally built around interviews that I conduct with world-class thinkers, founders, and above all, scientists. The interviews are very deep dives, they're quite unhurried, often running 90 minutes or more, and while they're absolutely not dumbed down, they're totally accessible to any non-expert who listens closely and patiently. Topics include neuroscience, AI, astronomy, cryptocurrency, drones, consciousness, and lots more. You can find an archive of 50 of these episodes at after-on.com or on your podcast player. Today, though, I'm the interviewee, and the topic is my TED Talk. The talk's topic is certain dangers that could be posed by a technology that I'm generally a rabid fan of, specifically synthetic biology. My interviewer is someone I admire greatly, Kevin Rose. Kevin is a media figure turned entrepreneur turned investor, and it's really hard to overstate his contributions to social media, to podcasting itself, and a lot more. Kevin saw me give my TED Talk in person, then interviewed me for his own podcast, The Kevin Rose Show, which I recommend to all of my listeners, and you'll get a very vivid sense for what it's like in a moment. And he's posting our interview simultaneously to his own feed. By the way, you don't have to watch my TED Talk before listening to our interview, although I hope you'll want to watch it afterward. Also, after the main interview with Kevin here, I'll have lots of extra resources connected to the risks discussed today, as well as news about something really exceptional I have for backers of this show on Patreon. But I'm just going to be brief for now because this episode is a bit like a nested Russian doll. You've just heard my intro, and you're about to hear the intro Kevin gives to our interview on his podcast. And before that, a brief sponsorship message from San Francisco investment firm Obvious Ventures. For you new listeners, I'm happy to report this bears absolutely no resemblance to traditional advertising. Instead, it takes the form of interviews that I conduct with smart people about emerging science, technology, and markets, which is basically what this show is. Today, I'm interviewing the founder and CEO of a company Obvious Ventures invested in. His name is Jose Ferreira, and his company is called Backpax. That's spelled B-A-K-P-A-X. Jose and Backpax are seeking to meld the two most ubiquitous technologies in education worldwide. Can you guess what they are? So, Jose, you're committed to using only truly ubiquitous tools in your education products. What does that push you toward?
The two universal technologies that you can pretty much count on finding everywhere are phones and paper. And bringing more technology into education, computers and tablets, runs the risk of integration challenges, systems go down, there's a lot of training and development that has to happen, and then you're dealing with children, and children lose passwords all the time and damage devices and so forth.
I've heard the most complete data out there is for U.S. schools. What percentage of them have deeply integrated tablets or computers into managing homework?
2 or 3% in K-12. And that's in the US, which is more digitally forward in education than just about any other country. Paper is the backbone of education globally today. To me, the really underutilized resource is phones, because they're everywhere, including the developing world, and every kid already knows how to use it. Teachers know how to use them. So we're trying to use the phone to solve problems that teachers actually have right now, like grading. Grading is a poor use of teachers' time. Teachers ought to be teachers, not graders. Now, they've got to do the grading because they need to keep their finger on the pulse of the class.
How is that different from our school days?
When we were kids, teachers did something called grading for accuracy, meaning we got it back a few days later and we were told which ones we got right and which ones we got wrong. A curious thing happened in the last 30 years, which is the rise of high-stakes testing.
And how do school administrators respond to that?
If you can't magically make every teacher instantly better, turn your schools into test prep schools, into cram schools, because more reps equals better test scores.
More reps like at the gym.
Just like at the gym. As a result, there's way more homework being assigned today. And it tracks closely to which state tests are coming up that year. For New York, third grade is a big math test. So all these third graders have a shocking amount of homework. You'll see kids who have 20, 30 questions a night.
And what load does that put on the teachers?
A typical middle school or high school math teacher has 3 to 5 sections of 20 to 30 students each, assigns 20 to 30 questions a night. So you're talking thousands of questions. And it's barely possible to actually grade for accuracy anymore.
Okay, it's Rob again. We're now going to hear the full episode of The Kevin Rose Show as he's running it this week, starting with his introduction, which I'm delighted to include because it'll give you a good sense for who Kevin is and what his show is about, which of course means that these are not my upcoming guests you're about to hear about, although they do both sound fascinating. Take it away, Kevin.
Hey everybody, Kevin Rose here. Welcome back to another episode of The Kevin Rose Show. It is good to be back. I promise this time we're going to have episodes coming at you every few weeks now. It has been a series of ups and downs as I've had a new baby girl. I didn't have the girl, but my wife Daria did. And it's been 3 months, so things are good. Mom is good, baby's good. I have 2 baby girls now, which is crazy. 1.5 and 3 months. That was back to back, which wasn't necessarily planned, but we had always wanted a second kid, so we're pretty grateful to have a healthy and happy baby. And her name is Nova, so things are good, and I am back in the podcast seat. I have a handful of really amazing guests coming up this summer. One is going to be pretty crazy if I can lock it down. There was this, I'll give you a little hint. There was this New York Times article that came out here. Well, there was actually one last year and one this year. I was talking to some Navy pilots who have seen these UFOs while out on missions in their F-16s. Now, what makes this different is that rather than just some random story by some random pilot, for the first time ever, the government has released footage of these UFOs. Now, they're not saying that these are aliens. They're just saying, here's some footage we have of crafts, and the crafts are traveling at speeds and staying in the air for 12 plus hours, which no aircraft can do due to either, if it's a drone, there will obviously be battery restrictions in terms of, just how much power you can put out in a drone and how long it can stay in the air. And then also, obviously, when you're talking about fuel burning vehicles, they can only be out there for a few hours. So these things that they've recorded have done all different types of crazy maneuvers. And what's really cool is that the government actually released this footage. So it's coming directly from the government. This is not somebody's handy cam just shooting footage in their backyard. So very cool stuff. I think I've locked down one of the pilots to come on the show. It just goes to show you kind of some of the random stuff I want to have on this podcast. And speaking of random stuff, I got to have Tim Ferriss back on to do another random show. We've been talking about getting together this summer. He's a busy dude working on some cool projects that he'd be pissed if I talked about, but he's got some cool stuff coming as well. So a couple of housekeeping things. One, go ahead and head on over to Instagram, do a search for Kevin Rose and follow me up there. I'd appreciate it. That's where you'll see all the latest and greatest little things that I'm playing around with. I've been doing a lot of stuff around the house lately, meaning I've been growing medicinal mushrooms, some lion's mane, taking some old oak logs and then inoculating them with mushroom spores and then sealing them up with wax and placing them in the backyard. And hopefully this fall we'll have some great lion's mane mushrooms. If you're not familiar with lion's mane, they are a really powerful mushroom it's great for brain health. So people that take lion's mane have just quicker response times and they seem to think clearer. And so it's one of those culinary mushrooms, but it's also medicinal mushroom at the same time. So, and they're quite expensive. They're $20 a pound or something. So when you grow them yourself, you obviously don't have to pay anything near that. I bought 1,000 plugs, which is 1,000 little wooden dowels for I want to say it was $50 or something like that. So not all of them will actually create the little fruit bodies and actually turn into mushrooms, but I'm hoping quite a few do. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, you can follow that stuff on Instagram, Kevin Rose. Today's guest is Rob Reed. This is Rob and I have been friends for quite some time, so this podcast is long overdue. Rob is a fascinating guy. He spent his early career, first of all, he went to Harvard, got his MBA there. He studied Middle Eastern history and I think Arabic at Stanford as well. So he's been all over the place. He's worked at Bain, Salomon Brothers, a venture capital firm. He's been an entrepreneur as well, which he created Listen.com. So I don't know if you remember way back, if you're old school like me, back in the first kind of Web 1.0 world, there was a handful of music services. You probably all remember Napster, the one that was illegal, but there were some legal music services, and one of them was Listen, and then Listen later created a service called Rhapsody, And he was the CEO and chairman of all this. And Rhapsody was the world's first unlimited on-demand music streaming service. So just like Spotify or Apple Music or any of these services that we enjoy today, this was that, but created way before its time, before iPods or anything else. And this was way back in probably 2000 or so. So he was on the forefront of all this stuff. That company went off to it was either went public or was sold. And so he's done quite well. He's built some really cool products over the years, but lately he's been a writer and he's been writing pieces. He wrote a covered story for Wired and he wrote for the New York Times. He's written for the Wall Street Journal. But lately, Rob has been writing fiction. So he writes fiction for Random House. He has a new novel that came out a few months ago called After On, and he also has a podcast called After On. And his podcast, actually, we have a lot of kind of guest crossover, so we have similar interests. He interviews, world-class thinkers, founders, scientists, talks about things like AI risk, synthetic biology, robotics, archaeology, and then he gets into some crazier things like lone wolf terrorism. He's a really deep thinker. And that's why I enjoyed chatting with him. And the reason I wanted to have him on the show is I was recently at the TED conference and I was watching all those different TED Talks. And each day they have these sessions where there's about 5 or 6 talks bundled into a session. And then they break for, bathroom break. And in between sessions, you kind of go off and grab some snacks or whatever in the main lobby hall. And everyone was coming out and talking about Rob's talk at TED. This isn't TEDx, this is the main TED. And it was a really frightening talk. In this talk, he speaks about synthetic biology and how in just a few decades from now, we're going to be able to print our own viruses, our own bacteria. I don't know exactly how this is going to take shape, but we get into that here. We talk about how right now today you can do basic gene editing and kind of find and replace with devices like CRISPR. And then we talk about where this is all headed. So he's one of those futurists where he's thinking 10, 20, 30 years out, and how eventually this type of technology is going to be in classrooms. So either it'll be at the university level, or maybe at some point we'll see things like these printing machines that you can actually purchase for your home or small lab. Now, the frightening thing here is that, as you can imagine, when you're printing these things, you're going to be printing actual life forms. And if you're doing that, it'll just be the transmission of source code. So if someone were to create something that is, let's say, damaging, a modified version of let's just say the flu virus, they would then just spread that around, send that in a file, email attachment, whatever it is in 30 years from now, and then give it to the person that would like to print it. They'd be able to print it, and as you can imagine, bad things happen. So we're going to talk about the risk here, how we get ahead of this and actually prevent something like this from happening. And it's just a fascinating look into this world of synthetic biology and where all things are going. And Rob is the right person. I think that after the talk, not only was everyone really excited about it, and I will say we're timing this podcast so that if you're listening to it now, his talk is now live on TED.com. So you can head over there and search for Rob Reed and find that talk. But it was frightening, but at the same time, we're just all thankful that Rob is the one kind of raising awareness here and making sure that we get in front of this so that we can prevent something bad from happening. Kind of scary, but a fun podcast and a brilliant person. So this is Rob Reed. Well, thanks for making time to do this.
And likewise.
I'm excited to chat about this stuff. It's a bummer I didn't get a chance to say hi to you at TED.
Yeah, well, there's so many people there and it's busy. But, it's, the beauty of the old TED was it was all in this one small place in Monterey, and it was impossible not to run into anybody. But it's, it's bigger now. It's grown up a bit.
It has indeed. It's pretty massive. Well, let's get started. I wanted to jump in. I got to say that your talk was probably the most terrifying out of all of the talks. I'd love for you to walk the audience through what you spoke about, because it's going to be coming out. I guess we're going to release this podcast when your talk goes live, so they'll be able to check it out as well. But can you give us kind of the overview and how you came up with this talk?
Yeah, so I'll give you the cliff notes on it. And the current release date is June 18th. So It may well be June 18th as people listen to this. And if in fact it is, the TED Talk will be up there. But basically, this is a set of thoughts that I've been working on pretty seriously for close to a year, a little bit less. And the first thing I did in detail really was I wrote an 11,000 word piece for Medium in 4 parts. It's behind the paywall, but they may push it out for a few days around the release of the talk about a certain set of existential risks. And existential risks have been kind of quite the thing, I'd say, for the past 4 or 5 years. Probably the one that people think about and write about and worry about the most is super AI risk, which is a very well-developed field at this point. Many dozens of people effectively work full-time thinking about that, and a smaller number of people seem to work full-time denouncing them for thinking about and worrying about it. I didn't focus on that too much in my Medium writing, although I did a little bit. But what I was really much more focused on is synthetic biology risk. And this is a hard thing emotionally for me to fret about because I personally see boundless promise in synthetic biology. And sort of a quick pocket definition of that would be the artificial manipulation of DNA to make novel, non-natural critters, often, microorganisms, but they can be larger than that have novel powers and capabilities. And I'm personally extremely excited about SynBio, which is the common abbreviation, and its potential. I believe that it will end the organ shortage. I think it will eventually heal our environment or contribute immensely to that. And it will extend a great number of lives and reduce a huge amount of suffering. I could go on for hours about what's exciting about synthetic biology, but like so many technologies, it can be considered to be dual use, which is to say there can be a very, very dark side to its application if it falls into malevolent hands or if it merely falls into incompetent hands. I'm more worried about malevolent hands, though. And so I've given a lot of thought to that. I've had access to some of the very top thinkers and practitioners in the world in synthetic biology because, like you, I have a podcast and mine is focused really on science, a bit of technology, but primarily science. And I've been lucky enough to get great access to very, very top people in a number of fields, SynBio being one of them, but also neuroscience, astronomy, astrophysics, and a bunch of other things. And as I dove into this topic, there were a few scenarios that really started to worry me that I hadn't seen a great deal of discussion about. So I wrote about that a few months ago, and then I really distilled and in some way dramatized my thoughts in the TED Talk.
I'd love to hear. Walk us through at least 1 or 2 of these crazy scenarios and how does this play out? Because the thing that I was curious about when I listened to your TED Talk was, that we've been talking about this for a long time in terms of not necessarily synthetic biology, but more on, maybe we go in and modify bird flu, and that's something that takes off, and a bad actor comes in and does that. Hasn't there been the threat of, whether it be chemical weapons or chemical warfare or whatever it may be for a long time, or is there new technologies in place now that make it just that much easier?
There is a long history, and the difference, what's changing now, is to modify bird flu in a way to make it really a truly deadly pathogen a decade ago. You would have had to been an incredibly credentialed, well-supplied scientist of the top order. And people like that tend to be successful and stable and put one foot in front of the other, and they don't tend to be bad guys. What's interesting about synthetic biology and what's exciting about it, but also potentially dangerous, is it's moving forward at a rate that is far faster than Moore's law. The rate at which we are able to synthesize base pairs or read base pairs, and the rate at which breakthroughs like CRISPR are coming onto the genome editing scene goes far beyond the rate of development that we even saw in computing. And the trouble is, our minds are not equipped to think naturally in exponential terms. When our ancestors were growing up on the savannah, there were lots of reasons to understand linear processes. And, this thing is running in this direction at this speed, and this is how I either flee it or intersect with it. Arithmetic properties. but not really exponential. And so our brains kind of melt down and our intuitions escape us when something is doubling every 8 months or every 12 months or every 7 months. And that's what's going on in synthetic biology. And the consequence of that is that there are things, I'll use George Church as an example because he's an incredibly prolific, well-regarded, and highly influential bioengineer. He has a lab that basically straddles both MIT and Harvard. There are things that George Church and his entire team couldn't possibly do today that will probably be very easy to do in a community college or high school biolab in about 20 years, simply because of the Carlson curve, which is what some people refer to the Moore's law curve of SynBio.
Now, is that also tracking cost as well?
Yes. So a very dramatic statistic is that in 2003, the Human Genome Project ended. We kind of sequenced half a genome, a single haploid genome.
Mm-hmm.
It took 13 years. It cost $3 billion. It involved thousands of the brightest minds in life sciences. So $3 billion in 13 years. A far better non-haploid genome can be now sequenced for less than $1,000 with a few minutes of engagement by a lab tech who might just be a high school grad. Now, it'll take more than a few minutes, but the active engagement of one well-trained, but nonetheless sort of tech level, not PhD, MD, PhD level brain. That's a price compression of 3 million X in gene sequencing.
You know, I know all the big players in the technology space, you know, when you talk about, you know, whether it be NVIDIA or AMD or Intel doing the main like chip fabrication these days, like who's doing this on the life sciences side?
Yeah, Illumina is the titan of gene sequencing. And sequencing is a really fancy way of saying reading. So basically, if you've ever had your genome read, or parts of it at 23andMe, that's sequencing. It's like reading the base pairs and understanding what monogenic mutations you have, you know, what your genes, how your genes are laid out, whether you have dangerous mutations, or doing the full genome sequencing of a human and finding all the points of difference with, you know, another person, which might establish whether you're related, whether you're vulnerable to the same diseases, and of all these countless species. This has gotten cheaper, again, at a rate of about 3 million X over the span of a decade and a half. And that rate of cheapening is accelerating. Now, you can read a lot of DNA and learn a great deal about it. And there's all kinds of fascinating subfields. Ancient DNA. We're starting to learn incredible things about archaic humans and Neanderthals and Denisovans. And that's really interesting. There's all kinds of things you can do when you get, let's say, 1 million fully sequenced genomes of 1 million individuals, and you've matched that with their phenotypes, fancy way of saying body, or their health records, and you start finding these correlations using big data and start finding vulnerabilities and start saying, wow, that gene leads to this condition. How does that gene, the protein made by that gene, play in the metabolic pathways of the cell? Because now maybe we can cure this disease. All kinds of great stuff that's going on.
I love this stuff. I'm just obsessed with my genetic polymorphisms, and I take all of my data and I export it out of 23andMe and I bring it into all these third-party analyzers, and you know, I'm working on my methylation pathways and like all the different types
all
of
that
stuff.
Yeah, so that's the good news, and the good news is electrifying, and the good news of synthetic biology is so electrifying that, bad as it would have been if we destroyed the world in 1979 in a nuclear war, and it would have been a tragedy without any parallel, it would arguably suck a lot more now because the future is so much brighter because of SynBio and a lot of other things. There's a lot that's going on that's so great. But so here's something I cited in the TED Talk. There is a strain of flu called H5N1. It is 60% lethal. 60% of the people who contract it die. That's worse than Ebola, a really, really lethal disease. But it is so uncontagious that it's killed fewer than 50 people since, I think, 2015 or 2013. I had the number down in the TED Talk. Very, very, very few people die of this thing. In 2011, which is ancient times in the world of synthetic biology, 2 separate research teams, one in Wisconsin and one in Holland, modified the H5N1 genome. And they basically created something that is every bit as deadly, but also wildly, wildly contagious.
Why are the people in Wisconsin doing that? Like, they've got, what's the purpose there?
Right. Well, Because, science, exclamation point. I mean, who knows? I'm sure in their case, and I think I read some interviews with them back in the day, they're virologists. They're probably arguing that we're advancing science and we're going to better understand pandemics. Great. And maybe there's some truth. I mean, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, right? These aren't, they didn't unleash it, right? So they're not diabolical people. This is called gain of function research. And the function that was gained is contagiousness. Now, in 2011, you would have to be a brilliant scientist to pull that off. Since 2011, again, ancient times in this world, what has been invented? Well, CRISPR. What they did was they edited the genome. CRISPR has made, that came along in 2013, has made it radically easier. This is a massive breakthrough that made it radically easier to edit genomes. The cost of reading genes and figuring out maybe where those vulnerabilities are that's preventing this H5N1 thing from being so contagious, we can read genes much faster and much more cheaper. And we can also, we're starting to get to the point where we can actually not just edit, but synthesize from the ground up, DNA printing. And so another company you were asking who's big, Twist Bioscience, they recently went public. They have a good shot at becoming the Illumina of data synthesis. And data synthesis, it's much more expensive and much slower now than data sequencing, which is reading, but it is speeding along at this incredible rate of development. And so the question we ask ourselves in creating this super deadly H5N1 flu, you could say, oh, they didn't do anything big. It's in a vault somewhere. It's in a freezer. What is there to worry about? But what they really created was a data file. The whole H5N1 genome, the whole of it, would fit on a few pages of paper. And not using a 26-letter alphabet, a 4-letter alphabet. This is not much data. The tiny changes that they implemented to make it contagious probably would fit on a Post-it note. And once data is made, it tends to persist. These files tend not to disappear. So the sort of ghost story I told during the TED Talk, a little speculative. I'm a science fiction writer, so folks who don't know much about me, I was a longtime tech entrepreneur. I started the Rhapsody music service, which people with prodigious memories will remember is basically the forerunner. We invented the model that Spotify now uses.
Well, I used it.
Thank you. Every former user that is out there, I appreciate it because we did get enough users to eventually sell. And then I became a science fiction writer. I write sprawling works of speculative fiction for Random House. And so in doing this talk, I was like, I'll tell you a little ghost story. So let's imagine it's 2026 and a brilliant virologist makes a much more deadly bug than this modified H5N1 thing. And she creates something that's as contagious, as deadly as Ebola, as contagious as chickenpox. And the kicker is it incubates in the body for a full year before causing an outbreak. So the whole world can be infected before the first sign of trouble. And she's doing this for her dissertation, or she's doing it for all the right reasons. But she makes this data file. And 90 days later, her university gets hacked, which is not science fiction. There was just one indictment from last year documented the hacking of 300 universities. This happens. And so this tiny little data file that she created that contains the bug's genome spreads to the internet's darkest corners where it hangs out with pirated copies of The Wire and ABBA songs, right? Once a file's out there, it's never coming back. And maybe in 2026, it would take a true genius, and let's assume our virologist, she's a true genius, to make the critter from that blueprint, because that really is just a blueprint. And animating a critter from that is hard. Well, Craig Venter and a few other people could do it today, but very few people. 2026, it'll be a hell of a lot easier, but it would still probably take a very high-octane life sciences postdoc or something like that. But 15 years go by. It's 41. And by 2041, you may be able to basically create that thing on a DNA printer you can find in any high school. And if that's not the case, then wait a decade or two. The technology is improving that rapidly. And so the danger is these things get made, they get lost. It's not geniuses who end up making them, but it's Columbine Kid 5.0. Or it's somebody like the guy who shot up the Batman premiere dressed as the Joker a few years ago. He was a neuroscience PhD student with an NIH grant. I mean, these are people with access. And people with access to more powerful technology than George Church will one day include high school kids, will one day include 8th graders. And once a genius has made a data file, any idiot can distribute it worldwide, can copy it, and eventually when the printers are there, can print it. So that is scary.
So, I mean, how do we, I guess you could add in certain checks into the printers where they have to go out, almost like they have to have an antivirus software installed and look for malicious files before they print them.
Mm-hmm.
There could be a known database, right?
There could absolutely be a known database.
Yeah, how else would you protect against something like that?
Well, that was really, so the last third of the TED Talk, and the other thing that I worry about, just to sort of complete, who are the bad actors? Like, who would unleash something like that? And the reality is about 1,000 people a year worldwide. The word I use is detonate. There are suicidal mass murderers out there. And, there's the Columbine killers, there's the Orlando shooter, there's the Vegas shooter. There were 323 mass shootings in the United States last year. So one of many possible bad actors would be somebody who's like, you know what, some really nihilistic state of mind, and they just want to kill they want to die in the act of killing as many people as possible. And unfortunately, society that's a malfunction that occurs several hundred times a year throughout the world. It crosses societies, religious lines, class lines, etc. And when that happens, the force multiplier is technology. So, kind of a grim fact, there are actually a lot of mass school attacks in China. We don't hear much about them because it's a far away. I don't know how much press they get, but also the most lethal items that you can buy at retail in China are hammers and knives.
Well, this just happened a few days ago in Japan. Did you hear about that?
It did, yeah. Mass stabbing, exactly. Yeah. And stabbed a lot of kids, but I believe only 2 fatalities.
Yeah, only 2 fatalities. A lot of kids were stabbed, like 17 or something like that.
Huge number,
horrible thing to have happen, but nowhere near the death toll that you see with a gun, obviously.
Yeah, compare it to Newtown. And so 2 deaths, horrible. 15 kids traumatized, horrible. But when the deadliest things sold at retail are hammers and knives, that's what's going to get used. And so there's this really macabre coincidence. There was a spate of mass school attacks in China, a spate of about 10 of them over the span of a couple of years. And by weird coincidence, macabre coincidence, the last one occurred just a few hours before the Newtown attack in Connecticut. But that one grotesque American act killed roughly the same number of people. In fact, I think it was one more person than the 10 Chinese attacks combined. So knife, terrible. Gun, much worse. But what about an airplane? So a couple times in the past few years, there was the Air Malaysia incident where a pilot decided to end it all and take his passengers and crew with him. And then there was another incident a year after that, German Wings, a pilot named Andreas Lubitz, who was, morbidly depressed. And German pilot guild rules basically said that his right to privacy about his morbid depression was far more important than the lives of the 150 people he ultimately killed when he drove his plane into the side of the French Alps. They might have changed those rules since then. So knife, gun, airplane, the worse the technology gets, when you have one of these people who detonate, the more casualties there will be. So now let's think about the proliferation of synbiotechnology. At this point, there are probably a handful of borderline geniuses who could probably make a doomsday bug that's 1/10 of 1% or maybe 1% effective. They tend to be, brilliant, stable people without criminal histories. But still, that's kind of scary to contemplate. As technology improves, at some point, it's going to be thousands of life science researchers that have that capability. And sometime after that, it's going to be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pre-meds and life science grad students. When you start getting into groups that big, again, remember the Joker, some tiny percentage of a very large group will reliably do something awful eventually.
Sure.
So what do we do about this? So that was what, what I'm hoping is that this talk will get out there and the ideas will get out there, because this kind of nihilistic attack has not really been discussed much in terms of synthetic biology, at least I'm not aware of. I'm hoping that it will provoke a conversation both within the industry and within society of just exactly what you said. Well, wait a second. What can we do about this? The fact is, there's probably dozens of things that we can do. And I talked about 2 things at the end of the talk, and they were ideas that I'd gotten from people who are very, very deep in the synbio field. I told them, I'm giving this talk, what are some things that we can think about? What are some hopeful notes that I can end on?
And what I ended up coming up with is an analogy, and this was actually in a conversation with our mutual friend Naval Ravikant. He and I have talked about this a lot, and he's had a lot of influence on my thinking, is an immune system. When our bodies fight off pathogens, they use these very agile, self-training, multi-layered immune systems. And I think the answer is, while we still have some decades here before things get really scary, let's start building this thing. Two obvious key layers. First of all, pathogen detectors. George Church has offered to write an op-ed. I'm going to write an op-ed the day that the TED Talk releases. And George has offered to write another one. That's a really big deal to me because I do think of him as being, I personally think of him as being the most influential bioengineer in the world. He's given a lot of thought to pathogen sensors. Today, they're pretty damn primitive. But with a little bit of R&D muscle, we could push those onto their own Moore's Law curve, in which pathogen sensors, bug germ detectors, if you want to refer to them more colloquially, can become increasingly ingenious, networked, and eventually as widespread as smoke detectors, and better yet, smartphones.
But a pathogen sensor, how does that function, first of all? And second, like, how would you update the kind of, definition file of what is evil?
How it works, that gets beyond my biological understanding, but they are out there. And so basically what it does is it samples the molecules in the air and the critters that are in the air. And as with every kind of detection thing, like, how good were digital cameras in 1995 versus today? Detection that goes down a path of technological development gets better and better and better. And so it's basically sampling the air. There's a little bit of this that happens at ports of entries and airports already. They have a very limited palette of things that they can test for. But as long as the testing apparatus is really, really sensitive and it can basically do a breakdown of like, okay, this is a molecule. What's the composition of the molecule? Okay, it's dominated by carbon. That's probably, a biological molecule. Let's, break it down further. You can use mass spectrography if you've got a big unit. And then, like I said, there are things that go beyond my knowledge. And there are things, as with everything in technology, that will be brilliant and invented in 3 years that we can't even foresee, just like even George Church couldn't have foreseen CRISPR. Developments happen. It would take some R&D muscle. In terms of how you update it for what's scary, that would be, how do you update a traffic report in Google, right? The key is that these things are networked. The key is that they're in constant dialogue with a central repository of pathogens, constant dialogue. And the key is that they're highly, highly distributed. And George sees no reason, and I defer to George on this, no reason why they couldn't be part of a smartphone eventually. Like, the technology, in his view, can get miniaturized to that degree, not next year, but if we make a priority of this, he says smoke detector ubiquity, eventually smart detector ubiquity, and then you have this swarm. It's like that. Have you ever used the app Dark Sky?
I have.
Yeah. So Dark Sky is wonderful, designed by Danny Hillis' group. It takes advantage of the fact that most smartphones have barometers on them. And so you hit Dark Sky and it can give you a local weather report within a few hundred yards and predict to the minute when the rain's going to start. And it's using all the data from AccuWeather or NOAA Weather or whatever, but it's also using all these barometers. And so I believe, and I don't want to put words in George's mouth, but I believe that the long-term scenario he sees is wildly distributed biosensors, ideally in everybody's hip pocket, and a really, really smart system that is constantly saying, whoa, shit, what's that?
Right.
And when there's a major whoa, shit, what's that? Then hopefully you've extended to the pharmacy level, the doctor's office level, or something where you can sequence that sucker really quickly and start looking for signal of pathogen. So that's a thing that suddenly makes us, gives us a very, very strong early warning system, like the DEW line during the Cold War. The other thing that complements that is a very agile, distributed biomanufacturing base that ideally extends into every pharmacy and perhaps indeed into our homes. And this would basically be printer technology for vaccines, above all things, but also medicines. And again, that's not crazy science fiction. These are things that are within reach within single-digit numbers of years if we put some R&D dollars behind it and then we let the market dive in and make piles of money, right?
That was actually a big question I had for you is like, how much are you underestimating the flip side of the doomsday scenario? Like this idea that there will be the ability to print vaccines in your own home. Like, I mean, that has to be, if the opposite is true and the doomsday scenario is true, then you would hope that the other piece is there to complement and to offset it, right?
If we think about it and start talking about it now, absolutely. And so that's why, despite my doomsaying, I rank myself as a serious optimist on this front. But the trick is we need to start freaking out now. Let's say the danger is 30 years hence. We can't start worrying about it in 29 years. These things take time. And think of all the billions and billions of dollars that are spent on digital security and the number of viruses that still get through. The human body is so much more complex than the Windows OS. And so it will be a constant. Yeah.
Now you're freaking me out again when you say Windows OS. I'm thinking about how many bugs and holes and issues there were. It's like, oh man, we're doomed.
And how goddamn simple that is. And so it will be an arms race. And we will have an overwhelming majority of people on the good guys' side. And we'll have a lot of spending power and a lot of R&D, and we'll have a lot of advantages. It will be much harder to fight this and make ourselves airtight than it is to make ourselves airtight against digital viruses, which means we need to start building the immune system quickly, both the detection and the distributed biomanufacturing base. And again, it's not out of the question that we can do these things, but we need to be smart and early about them. And then like what you said, known pathogens should not be printed. And in fact, if somebody tries to print Ebola, there should be a flag that goes up, at the Centers for Disease Control and the FBI, and that person gets shut down. Now, the trouble is, maybe you could make a software compiler that wouldn't print, that wouldn't compile any known virus, but creative people are making new viruses all the time. And biology is not really as much of a design science as software. It's certainly not mechanical engineering. You can't necessarily look at a string of base pairs and say, oh, I know what that critter does. In fact, you definitely can't. I mean, we gaze at the base pairs in our own genomes, which are very well sequenced and very well known in our own genes. And in many cases, we're like, we have no idea what that fucking gene does. Mm-hmm. But we know the letter code's cold. So certainly not printing known pathogens is a thing we should do. But in and of itself, it's not satisfactory. There's another argument that some make that maybe distributed DNA printers should just simply not be made, and that all DNA should be synthesized in centralized labs like Twist Bio. Twist would be handicapped in that they wouldn't necessarily know what every goddamn thing does. But if you only have a few carefully monitored places where DNA does get synthesized, again, you're starting to lock down some of the holes that people could manipulate.
Mm-hmm. And then how hard would it be, do you think, if, let's just say this does play out and there are home printers or printers at universities or whatever it may be, there is a bad actor, this does happen. Like, what's your, in terms of coming up with an antidote or a vaccine for something like that, how difficult will that be in this world, several decades out?
That's again something that I don't think George Church himself could answer. And as somebody who studied Arabic and Middle Eastern history in college and now writes science fiction and podcasts, it's beyond my ability to predict what might happen after dozens of turns of the Carlson curve, the Moore's Law equivalent. But again, we have some advantages here. And a very, very big one is, boy, do we have the numbers on our side. The bar to being a good guy here, particularly if you get somebody who's a pure nihilist, who wants to take a shot on goal at killing us all. And those people are out there. They don't act on their desires because how could they? Look at the Vegas killer. Mm-hmm. He slaughtered 58 people. Did he stop there because he had enough? No. And we know this because he shot another 422 other people who he surely would have preferred to kill. And I don't think we can rationally assume he would have stopped at 4,200 people. In fact, with somebody that nihilistic, he may well have gladly killed us all or not. We don't know. But we do know there are a lot of very pathological people out there. We know that there are people with crushing mood disorders. We know there are people who suffer deranging traumas that probably completely convert who they are. And historically, there's only been roughly 2 people at any given time who've been in a position to destroy the world. The head of the Soviet bloc back in the day and the NATO alliance back in the day. And to rise to that level, so two-ish people for a period of decades, up to and including today, could wake up on the wrong side of the bed and destroy humanity. They haven't done that yet. The danger is that group grows,
Right.
And if you've risen to the top of an intensely competitive political society like Russia or the United States, say what you want about the current president, but suicidal nihilists generally don't get that far. They're generally not that well organized. So, fast forwarding, if somebody comes along who says, I really want to kill everybody, there's all kinds of pathogens that are up on the Reddit of tomorrow. And, I've got a way to sort of get this software hack that will allow me to override the protective systems on the biolab in my high school or my junior high school, and I'm just going to go for it. Who knows? I would like to think that a rogue high school kid or even a rogue neuroscience PhD student would not be able to think of everything that the good guys have thought of in the 30 years of preparing for this. But in order for us to have that advantage, we do need to start thinking about this now.
Mhm.
This has to become part of the discipline of synthetic biology, thinking about the worst things that can happen and prepare for them way, way, way in advance. We do have the numbers. For every 1,000,001 bioengineers, 1,000,000 will be on our side. And if those 1,000,000 good guy bioengineers spend, let's take a page out of Google's book, spend 20% of their time, they and their employers dedicate 20% of bioengineering time to dreaming up defenses for the common good, you can start creating something that's pretty, I wouldn't want to say bulletproof, but it's who can out imagine who. The
Mhm.
tools will be there. And an example I like to use is 9/11, right? So Osama bin Laden had a lot of advantages. He had a lot of money. He was a lot more evil than most people, and he's pretty charismatic, etc. But he wasn't an Einstein-level genius. And so by definition, the plan that him and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed came up with was a non-ingenious plan. Who were they going up against? Well, they were going up against our national security infrastructure. We didn't lack foresight. We actually hardened the airports in the United States to terrorists in the 1970s. No lack of foresight, right? We didn't suffer from a lack of resources because we literally spent trillions of dollars in the wake of 9/11 responding to it. The one thing that we lacked was, a conference room full of smart people, a handful of smart young people with pizza and beer, thinking about what are the worst things a terrorist could do. That room couldn't have existed because if it had, and there were a handful of smart folks from diverse backgrounds, maybe, overrepresenting places that suffered a lot of terrorism as a nation of immigrants, we get to have people from everywhere. So you'd have people from Sri Lanka. Back in 2001, there was a lot of terrorism there from the Tamil Tigers. You'd certainly have Middle East. Maybe you'd still have Ireland, whatever it is. Sitting in a room saying, okay, what are the spectacular things terrorists do? Well, they hijack planes. That was already a thing. Okay, so hijacking planes. What else do they do? Well, they do suicide bombing. By 2001, that was a big thing. Anything else? I don't know, robbing banks. The list is, it's kind of hijacking planes and suicide bombing. How long does it take to put those two together if somebody's job is to think evil thoughts? I don't know. I think they figure it out before the first lunch break. Because, by the way, let's not forget, we were the victims. The United States was the victims of almost 3,000 suicidal pilots in World War II.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Right? So the imagination gap. So that's the thing we need to do. We need to have some subset of really, really smart synbio specialists have as their job thinking those diabolical thoughts. What's the worst thing people can do with the stuff that we have there? Mm-hmm. And if we just have enough of those people and they're smart enough and the infrastructure is listening to them, then hopefully, the bad guy who comes along, tomorrow's Batman shooter, even if he comes up with an ingenious idea because he's a neuroscience PhD student, it's going to be something that our guys in the conference room with the pizza and beer thought up 17 years ago.
Yeah.
Nice try.
How do you convince people that this is inevitable? Like, I'll give you an example. A couple decades ago, people probably would have said, well, at some point there will be miniature nuclear reactors in your home or outside of your home that will power your house and the neighborhood or whatever it may be. And that cost will come down to nothing, and it'll be this wonderful technology that potentially some people could use for other things. But still, yet today, it remains a pretty laborious, difficult process to enrich and create nuclear weapons. You would think that would be pretty easy these days. Why is this going to be true for synthetic biology, but it's not for nuclear war, nuclear weapons?
Well, put it this way. I guess Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 1945.
Right.
Let's say that's the equivalent of 2003 when this multi-billion-dollar human genome project results in something spectacularly expensive, right? If in 1960 it was possible to make a Hiroshima-scale bomb for 1/3 millionth of the cost of the Hiroshima bomb, I think people would be having those conversations. But it just happens to take the infrastructure of a nation state to make a nuclear weapon. Thank God. So we simply there is not a Moore's law curve of nuclear weaponry. It's probably improved. I mean, certainly when you went from the atomic to the hydrogen bomb, your destructive power went way up. A lot of bang for the buck, as Curtis LeMay was wont to say. But the cost of making a nuclear weapon, the simplicity of it, was never, ever on a plane trajectory to get into high school laboratories. And so that would be my response. We just didn't see that. In this case, we have decades, and they predate, I mean, the compression curves, I'm sure you've seen Ray Kurzweil's charts tracing Moore's law clear back to the 1800s with mechanical adding machines and so forth. And maybe he massages his data a little bit, but it looks like a steady logarithmic curve with over a century of history. The Carlson curve, I mean, that goes back at least to the 70s, the earliest days of recombinant DNA. This stuff has been getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and there is no limit in sight. And so you just draw the lines and you say, yeah, we're going to be there. We are going to be there. And then the key leap that I think people sometimes fail to make is they say, well, fine, what is an MIT grad student genius going to do? I mean, these people don't blow up. And the answer is, well, yeah, over enough time with enough of them, they do blow up.
Sure.
But even if not, it's just once the infrastructure is out there, it no longer, actually, this is a fun example. If you wanted to play checkers with a computer in 1952, you literally had to be a guy named Arthur Samuel, who had a Nobel adjacent brain. He was one of the top programmers in the world, and he managed to get unlimited access to one of the most powerful computers in the world. And then he was able to teach it to play checkers, right? Now, all you need to play all the checkers you want is you just need to know somebody who knows somebody who has a cell phone. You don't have to be a genius like Arthur Samuel. And somebody as brilliant as Arthur Samuel would not have been able to play checkers against a computer in 1951, right? So the infrastructure ends up making godlike, genius level, historic impossibilities the private domain of one or two living geniuses, and then diffuse them to pretty much everybody. If the technology is essentially digital, which biology is and computing is, and nuclear is not.
Gotcha. Have you ever seen a CRISPR machine?
Well, CRISPR is done in a variety of settings. There's not really like a machine. I've definitely been to labs where CRISPR is practiced.
So it's just a procedure, basically. There's no.
Yeah, there's not like a toaster of CRISPR. It's
interesting.
It's more of a technique. What I have seen are DNA sequencing and synthesis machines, and it's really amazing to see the most up-to-date Illumina machine, which I saw in a lab, which does essentially the work of the Human Genome Project in a box that's like a very large microwave oven.
Wow. See, that's what I was trying to get at. I was like, how big are these machines? And eventually, are they, I'm thinking, I always picture like mainframe computers,
No, I mean, the thing that basically represents the work of thousands of brilliant life scientists. And remember, Human Genome Project is 2003. We're not talking about checkers in the 50s anymore. I mean, W was president, right? Friends was on the air. This is a culturally recent time. So basically, you have boxed thousands of scientists and 13 years of time in something that's like, to be clear, very, very, very large microwave oven, not one you'd buy, but closer in size to a microwave oven than a refrigerator.
That's crazy. Have you had your full genome sequenced?
I have not. I plan to soonish. Because I think we're now just getting to the point. There's a brilliant guy at the Broad Institute, which kind of crosses MIT and Harvard. It's both of them really, named Robert Greene, who I had as a guest on my podcast, who is a real advocate for personal genomics. And he has persuaded me the last time I had dinner with him a few weeks ago that now there is enough actionable data that will come out of a full genome sequencing that would not come out of just 23andMe, that it's just getting to the cusp of being worthwhile. And so I probably will at some point in the next year.
Where do you go to do that?
I think Veritas does it commercially. I would go personally directly to Robert because I know him, but the Broad Institute, where he is, probably sequences more full genomes than almost anybody. And, there's ways to kind of get in the door there. But I'm pretty sure Veritas will do it for anybody. And I think there's a couple other places that are out there. And the $1,000 price point is a little bit of a myth. We've been saying that because it's a nice round number for a while. But when you really dig into it, it's a little bit more expensive than that. But what's most important is that you get access to what's called a genomic counselor, which is somebody who will really, really help you interpret this complex data. And that's what makes the services a little bit more expensive. There are a couple of people, George Church is doing a project where he wants to sequence 100,000 people. I think that the downside with that project is that you have to be willing to have your data be entirely public, because he wants to make it an academic database that anybody can access. And so some people are a little concerned about that. And then there's a US government project that's just spinning up that's going to sequence 1 million people. So there are ways out there. It's still a little bit early, but I think when the day comes that it's really, really, truly clinically actionable to get full sequencing, I'd be astounded if 23andMe didn't start offering it like a year or two before then.
I'm curious, you've probably had your 23, I'm sure you've had your 23andMe done, right?
Yeah, long enough ago that it was actually the pretty primitive version, not as advanced as it is now.
Okay. Have you looked at any of your polymorphisms, and is there anything that you do day to day or change in your diet or otherwise?
That's why I'm probably going to get off my butt and get it done and use the fact that I'm buddies with Robert Greene to get a full lowdown. Because the thing is, when I got 23andMe done, it was shortly after it released. This is the curse
the
of
V1
being,
chip.
Yeah, this is the curse of being an early adopter, right?
I had mine redone. So I did it for the V1 chip, and you're missing some stuff there.
I have no doubt.
It's funny. I went in and I got the new kit, because back in the day it was really expensive. I got the new kit. I'm like, great. Okay, this will be the V3 or V4 chip that they have now. Spit in the tube, send it in. And I expected there to be just like this email saying like, okay, hey, we've updated your results. Instead, they sent me an email saying I have a twin brother.
What?
Well, because they saw an identical like
oh, genome.
Yeah, and they were like, I was like, oh no, it's like now my data is like skewed, and every time I log in, it says I have a twin, which is pretty
not
hilarious.
A great advertisement for 23andMe. They should kind of be able to figure
I mean,
that
maybe
out.
I did something wrong. I probably signed up for a new account under a different email, and that was the issue. Or I don't know.
Yeah. Well, what's intriguing to me a little bit is I'm adopted. And so when I get the cousin alerts, it's always pretty interesting because I've got untold numbers of biological relatives out there that I'm not aware of.
Right. Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I'm curious at having all of this in your head, which is just, I mean, how do you sleep at night? And two, are you a prepper at all? Like, do you do anything do you have a missile silo somewhere? Like, what are you doing as precautions here?
Well, I think the best thing that I can do is generate some awareness around this. And I believe that the TED Talk, I'm very pleased with the talk that I did. I actually only had 11 days to put it together. I don't know if I mentioned that to you.
That's Daria told me that. That's insane.
Yeah. I had done a podcast episode. It was actually a conversation with our buddy Naval. And we discussed these issues. Actually, it was a 2-part episode back in March. And then the TED folks heard it. And of course, as chance would have it, they happened to call on April Fool's Day and said, Rob, the conference is a week and a half from now. We want you to do this. I'm like, ha, 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 very funny. But they were serious. And so I put this thing together very quickly, but I had been thinking and writing and so forth about these issues for a while. So it kind of came naturally. And it went over, you were there. It went over quite well. I think
It did.
The delivery, I had 81 slides to just illustrate the points and drive them home. And, they're editing it and they're going to put it up on the 18th. And so my fervent hope is that it's enough of a ghost story. People like ghost stories and they find them intriguing, right? That I'm hoping that this can be can start a broader conversation. I think the fact that George Church has agreed to write an op-ed on the day that this thing comes out. And we haven't figured out where we're going to run them yet. I'm going to write one, he's going to write another, and I have a third person in mind to write a third. Hopefully that will level it up to a point of discussion in the industry. I was very, very careful to talk to, I think it was probably close to a dozen people who are the academic scientists in this field or practicing PhDs that have SynBio companies. Ran my talk by as many people as I could to say, am I missing something? Am I saying something that's just stupid that's going to get the whole thing dismissed? Nobody flagged anything. So I'm hoping that it will be taken quite seriously in the most important circles. And I'm hoping that it'll become a discussion point and it will gather some momentum. So in terms of what I can do, that's thing number one. Thing number two that I've toyed with is this. I actually think storytellers, science fiction writers and others, people who produce TV and movies, I'm not one of those people, can do a great deal to advance political justice and to help people dodge bullets. I think a very big reason why we survived the Cold War is that we spent decades telling ourselves terrifying ghost stories, with names like Failsafe and On the Beach and Dr. Strangelove and War Games. And that made the dangers of that period extremely real and visceral to everybody. And it transmitted up from the body politic to politicians. It was clear to everybody, we do not want this to happen. And so when the Cuban Missile Crisis came along and other crises as well, we didn't have to count on the chain-smoking people in those war rooms in Washington and Moscow to have great imaginations. Hollywood and writers and others had already exerted their imaginations on their behalf. And so I think that, actually my most recent novel, which came out a year and a half ago, is called After On. There is a SynBio terror subplot. It's not the center of the story, but it's in there. And it warns of something rather similar to this. And I think maybe my next science fiction novel should be like a real, I tend to write things that are fairly esoteric and appeal to a fairly narrow and brainy group of readers. But maybe I should just let myself write a real rip-roaring, page-turning potboiler that gears on this kind of story, or hopefully encourage lots of other science fiction writers and movie and TV people, like get the stories out there. I think one reason why Silicon Valley has actually taken super AI risk more seriously, more quickly than one might have expected is that movies like Terminator really made this concept popularly accessible. Movies like Ex Machina, movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Those are sci-fi scenarios. They're simplified in some ways, and those particular scenarios aren't going to play out. But they created this incredible shared cultural familiarity and also a shorthand for us to talk about it. And one day, I won't forget, a friend of mine came up to me and said, holy shit, man, I just saw a tweet and Elon is afraid of the Terminator scenario. Elon is afraid of what is that, 7-8 syllables. In those 7-8 syllables, an enormous wealth of information and alarm was transmitted to me because I knew what the Terminator scenario was and I knew who Elon was. And so creating a shared vocabulary around this, some of it cultural, with like, oh my God, the Hot Zone was a long ago movie that was sort of like this. Or the Hot Zone scenario, let's something updated for that. And Naval and I talked when we had our podcast interview, which, like I said, we posted back in March. We actually brainstormed about vocabulary that people could use that could be sort of catchy and stick in your brain, so that we could start talking about this stuff in a way that's culturally shared. So I think for me, the job, I'm not a synthetic biologist, obviously, but I think pointing at the danger in a way that's hopefully a little viral, I'm praying that TED Talk gets out there pretty broadly. A little dramatic, a little entertaining. As you probably remember, there were a few minutes of dark humor. I got a few laughs in that talk, which I thought was deliberate. It softens it. It makes it a little more fun. It makes it, people lean in a bit more. And people do like ghost stories. It's a good ghost story. And if they could be true ghost stories, they get more excited. That's why everybody was so into UFOs back when a lot of people believed that they might be real. There's a frisson.
Listen, I still think they're real. Did you see all
that New York Times piece? Yeah,
Yes.
That was wild.
There's
That was
just
wild.
Like more and more data coming out from the government saying they don't know what these things are.
I know. That one was something. I loved that. Now, I love that story, and so did you, right? Did you read it twice? Did you share it?
Yeah, I shared it. Absolutely.
It's exciting as hell because, oh my God, how scary aliens, but also, oh my God, how cool aliens. Like, oh my God, how scary Columbine kid eradicates the world, but it's also a ghost story and it's kind of cool. And then if you pair it with the electrifying message that this is not destiny. I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes Al Gore made, well, he made a few, but with Inconvenient Truth, which was extraordinarily well argued, he took people directly from denial to despair. You could go into that movie in a state of denial, be persuaded, and come out in a state of despair. And people don't act in either of those states. If you're in a state of denial, of course, you're not going to do anything. And if you're in a state of despair, you're going to be, I'm going to get drunk tonight.
That's a great point, actually.
So I was very, very careful to be 2/3 ghost story with a few laugh lines and some fun charts, 81 of them, and end on that optimistic note. We can do this.
Yeah.
These outcomes are optional. They are not destiny. They're optional.
I'm going to say two things. One, if you're listening to this and this got you a little bit freaked out, you should definitely go and watch the full length TED Talk. I'll link up to it in the show notes, and then obviously share it far and wide because we want to get this information out there. And then the other thing too, I want to mention before we wrap things up, Rob, is just give us a quick little 30-second overview of your book After On, because I never had you on the show to talk about that, and that could probably use its own podcast to just chat about that. But that you released that, what has it been, maybe a year now?
A bit more than a year and a half, actually.
Oh, wow,
yeah.
Crazy. Time flies. Tell us about the book.
So the book is, and the podcast has the same name. I'll mention the podcast at the end too, because they're connected. So the book After On is the tale of a diabolical social media company based in San Francisco. And it's set in the present day. Actually, I like to say it's set 9 seconds into the future.
So Facebook.
Well, no, it's called Flutter. I know, of course. Well, it's PHLUTTR. Because we know how, as the former founder of DIGG knows, we sure know how to spell in Silicon Valley. So it's PHLUTTR. It's called Flutter. And there's a lot about the book that's very playful, but there's a lot about it that's dead serious. And so this will sound like a spoiler, but you'll see it coming from the very, very beginning, that midway through the book, the social network Flutter attains consciousness. And rather than becoming a genocidal robot intent on destroying us all, she takes her character from the fact that she's a social network and becomes something that I personally find almost a little scarier, which is basically a super intelligent, hyper empowered 14-year-old mean girl. Hilarity ensues, but it is, so there's a playfulness to that. But it's also a very serious contemplation on AI risk, which I do take seriously. I actually think it's a more distant risk than SynBio risk, and it's a more speculative risk, but it gets deep into that. It gets deep into SynBio risk. SynBio is baked very, very deep into the storyline. And it goes deep into lone wolf terrorism as well. I spent my first couple of years out of college living in Cairo and learned Arabic pretty well and have ranged all over that region. And so that's something I've been thinking about and worrying about for really, really for decades. And so all those themes are integrated. It's kind of also an ambitious storytelling style in that a lot of it is just sort of traditional narrative, but there's, all kinds of blog posts and tweets. There's another novel within the novel that if it were finished, it's written in this very strident tone. If this novel, and when it first shows up, it's mysterious as to what this novel is. If I were to finish it, and I will not, I'm quite convinced it would be the single worst science fiction novel ever written. and boy, did I have fun writing it. The story's told through dozens of Amazon reviews, and all these things kind of stitched together in a way that I had a lot of fun with. But it's a serious contemplation about AI risk, SynBio risk, and came out about a year and a half ago. And then the genesis of the podcast was I was writing about things that I knew as a longtime entrepreneur. I certainly understood Silicon Valley culture and entrepreneurial finance, and this very self-referential present day Bay Area culture that we all saturate in. But I didn't know much about neuroscience or consciousness. I didn't know much about SynBio yet. I didn't know anything about quantum computing, which is important. So I ended up interviewing a lot of real expert people so I could get those bits right. And then when the book was, including our friend Adam Gazzaley, who was my neuroscience guru, and then as the book was getting ready to come out, I thought it'd be really fun to do just sort of a special edition, just 8 limited edition, 8 episode podcast in which I re-interviewed these experts, and kind of brought that to the readers as sort of like going deeper into the topics than I could in the book itself. And so of those 8 episodes, I'm about to post episode number 50 because I really had fun doing that. So I now interview mainly scientists, but thinkers, founders, and scientists is what I say. And, get deep into astrophysics, big interest of mine, dark matter, black holes, dark energy, a lot of stuff about neuroscience. I've had a lot of neuroscientists on. Just had Stuart Russell talking about AI. I just had Rick Doblin, who's the person who's pushing for the legalization of MDMA for therapeutic uses.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so he was he's my current guest. So lots of things, and they're deep. They're probably average 90-ish minutes. And try to convey this person's life work in a deep, organized conversation to any non-expert who wants to access it. So that's kind of what that became.
Awesome.
Yeah. But maybe my next one will be a SynBio terror page turner.
Yeah, seriously. Well, I'm so glad that you're doing this work. I mean, it's after watching your talk, I realized it's funny because you had reached out to Daria, and I was going to reach out to you independently and have you on the show. So it was just like it stars align. Yeah. So, well, thank you for being on the show, Rob. This has been fascinating. And I'm real quick, like, what's the best place that people can follow all this stuff? Is there a place like that do you tweet a lot? Like, where can people tune in?
Yeah. So the 2 places are, the podcast is really my main creative project this year.
Yeah.
And that is after-on.com. And, or you can obviously, find it in your favorite podcatcher, your favorite podcast player. And then the only social network I'm really active on, and it's not all that active, but I am on Twitter. And I go through phases, but what I do, the main thing with Twitter is I will put up a pretty good descriptive rundown on each new episode as it goes up. And on Twitter, I'm Rob_Reid, REID.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rob.
Thank you. It's been really great to be here. It's an honor to appear.
I'm going to go try and research my abandoned missile silos now.
Hey, this is Rob, back briefly in my normal role as host and interviewer. Huge thanks to Kevin for including me on his show this week. In a moment, I'll share quite a few resources connected to SynBio risk and what we can do about it, as well as some updates. But first, we'll spend another 2 quick minutes with Jose Ferreira, hearing about his company Backpacks and Educational Technology. So you said the amount of homework today often forces teachers to grade for completion, which is to say verifying there's a credible amount of work on the page, but not grading it for accuracy.
What most teachers do today is they do a blend. Every 4th problem, they grade for accuracy, things like that. And so they're sampling. Wouldn't it be great to give them a much stronger signal if you could grade for accuracy for 100% of the questions, and at the same time give them hours of their life back?
And how do you do that?
A big part of what we're building is an auto grader that takes symbols, equations, up to 4 or 5 words. We can auto grade. It rests on a type of artificial intelligence that can recognize text or handwriting.
And you've also said this has the effect of rescuing a lot of valuable data.
Every day, 1.5 billion or so kids around the world go home from school and do a chunk of homework, dutifully recording what they got right and what they struggled with. So then a few days later, all those pieces of paper with 50 billion questions answered are just all thrown in the trash. Now, what if you could capture all that information and build kind of a perpetual learning history for each student?
What does a student do differently in using your tool?
The student goes home, does her homework, holds her phone over it, and runs it through our app, and then about 5 or 10 seconds later, she'll be told, here's what you got right, here's what you got wrong.
Oh, so it's very instant feedback.
It's pretty fast, yeah.
What's the sweet spot in terms of subject matter and grade levels?
It can work on just about any subject matter as long as the answer is a few words or less. So that could be 5th grade grammar, where you've got 30 questions about pronoun error, foreign language, and as you'd imagine, like a lot of STEM.
And what impact do you expect this to have on teachers?
We think we'll save teachers 5 to 10 hours a week. They'll reinvest some of that time back in their students, one-on-one or small group outside of class, because that's why teachers get into teaching, is because they want to do stuff like that. They don't get into teaching because they want to grade 30 questions a night per student.
So huge thanks to Jose for spending that time with me. You can find out more about his company Backpax at bakpax.com. And huge thanks to Obvious Ventures for making this entire winter and spring of episodes feasible. You can find out more about them at obvious.com. And massive thanks one more time to Kevin Rose for having me on his show. I'm going to close with pointers to some resources connected to today's topics. First of all, the longest thing I've written about existential risk ran as a 4-part essay behind the paywall at medium.com in the fall. Although it remains behind the paywall, I believe non-subscribers to Medium can seamlessly access those articles via links in Twitter, so I'll be tweeting links to all 4 segments this week. You can find those at Rob_Reed on Twitter. Also, I'll be linking to all of that from this episode's show notes. And huge thanks to Medium for giving me permission to record those essays as a sort of mini audiobook, which is available to anyone who backs this show at a level of $5 a month or more at patreon.com/Rob Reed. That's patreon.com, and Reed is spelled R-E-I-D. This show quite literally would not exist without the support of the 1,000+ people who back it there, because I was really stubborn about not taking sponsorship on the show until I found a really perfect fit in terms of both the sponsor and the kind of content we could put together. As a result of my idealism, or maybe it was obstinance, I was purely supporter-backed for a year and a half, until March. And here it is June, so I haven't been sponsored for very long. And I was excited to record this long Medium essay for my backers because I've been thinking of it as the start of my 5th book, which may be more of an audiobook than a printed book because I'm obviously dabbling quite a bit in the medium of recorded voice these days. And even as I wrote the essay for Medium, I thought of it as a spoken word piece. I therefore vocalized it throughout the writing process, and if a sentence didn't sound right, I would write it differently until it did sound right. So even if you've already read this piece, you can now encounter it in the way it was really meant to be encountered at Patreon. And I'm grateful to Medium for giving me the green light to share it in this way, which was essential because they do have exclusive rights on these essays for several more months. Being far, far longer than the TED Talk, the essay explores a lot of its themes in much more depth, and also explores many themes that are not in the talk. Now, the next big step in my own thinking about these issues came in the form of a conversation I had with the brilliant serial entrepreneur and thinker Naval Ravikant a couple months after writing that essay. That conversation ran as a double episode of my podcast back in March. You'll find it in my feed. And that conversation is being serialized this week on the massive tech news site Ars Technica, in 4 segments, accompanied by a set of 7 articles written by me and 2 brilliant experts in synthetic biology, Andrew Hessel and George Church, both of whom have been guests on this show. I've linked to the first of those in my show notes and will be tweeting them throughout the week as they come out. As for further resources, if you're interested in a very broad and challenging piece about tech-enabled existential risk in general, I strongly recommend The Vulnerable World Hypothesis by Nicholas Bostrom. Nicholas is the pioneering thinker in this field. In fact, I believe he came up with the term existential risk. I will link to that too from the show notes. And finally, if you'd like to develop a broad understanding of synthetic biology, there are 2 books I'd recommend: Regenesis by George Church and A Crack in Creation by Jennifer Doudna, which focuses on the work that she and others did developing the CRISPR genome editing system. And of course, there are a bunch of shows on this very podcast which collectively lay out the amazing potential of synthetic biology. They start with episode 4, an interview with Andrew Hessel, which constitutes a broad overview of the field. Episode 16 is a great survey of personal genomics with Robert Greene of the Broad Institute. a joint creation of Harvard and MIT. Episode 24 is a sweeping interview with George Church, who is without question one of the world's most influential bioengineers. In episode 28, Daniel Kraft talks about exponential medicine writ large and its incredible promise. In episode 31, I sit down with Floyd Romisberg, the first person to actually add new letters to the ancient four-letter DNA code. That's a mind-blowing conversation. Ancient DNA is the topic of an amazing conversation with Harvard's David Reich. In episode 35, that considers our roots amongst Neanderthals, archaic humans, and others, as documented in our own DNA. Episode 39 is a conversation with Stanford's E.J. Chichelniski and his astounding work creating retinal prosthetics which could literally bring sight to the blind, among other things. And in episode 43, I sit down with MIT's Ed Boyden to discuss the amazing neurotechnological tools he has invented or co-invented, things like optogenetics and expansion microscopy. So there's a ton about synthetic biology and related topics here in the very podcast feed you are listening to now. Last, a quick announcement. If you will be in or near the city of San Francisco on Wednesday, June 26th, I will interview this podcast's next guest, science writer Annika Harris, live on stage at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Tickets are $10 in advance, and both Annika and I have tweeted the details. The occasion is that Annika has just released a concise yet oddly sweeping book about consciousness. This will be the subject of my interview with her on this podcast next week and on stage with her in San Francisco the following night. Please join us for one or both. That's it for now. Thank you to Ted for inviting me to speak, to Kevin Rose, to Obvious Ventures, to Jose Ferreira, and to the 1,000+ people who have been relentlessly backing me on Patreon since February of last year. If you'd like to show your support for this show in a non-financial way, please consider reviewing it on your podcasting app. That's free, takes just seconds, and makes a huge difference. Or talk it up on social media. Thank you, and see you next week.